Yeah.
What kind of playing instrument music do they want?
We're playing music right now.
Yes.
Yeah.
And when will we start it again?
Would you like us to start it again at the start of the presentation?
Yes.
Okay.
Do have a lead into the presentation.
Okay. So we're meeting more introduction.
Yes. Great. Well, my name is Lawson Jagler. I teach at the Russian and Studies Department. It's really my greatest pleasure to be welcoming you to this event and to be introducing in the first place how we were an African scholar, African minister, but a founding internationalist and cultural ambassador, whom I have greatly admired ever since our first meeting at the Institute of African Studies in Moscow in 2014. Charles' life, from his childhood in Savannah, Georgia, in the 20s and 40s, to his days in Moscow in the late 1950s and early 60s, to his interactions with Castro in Cuba and his later travels in China, really deserves a biography in itself. But I'll try to keep it short. So, in the US, after a year of teaching at the University of Paris Saint-Denis, Carlos recruited to be the founding chair of Africana Studies, the Africana Studies Department at Rutgers, instilling the department with the Pan-African institutes that I'm very happy to say it still retains. Cal was also instrumental in the rehabilitation of Paul Robson by 1970s last.
Following the blacklists and the red baiting of the McCarthy era.
Whitelist.
In addition to his numerous publications on Robson, Cal got the Rutgers, Robson's alma mater, to award him an honorary degree and organized that same year, 1973, a Robson Film Symposium. Indeed, Cal's involvement with film deserves a special mention. He has written about an interview with Semben Usman and numerous other African filmmakers, attended and served on the jury of many film festivals from Zanzibar to Havana. Much of this work he has done through the Black Film Project. These days, Cal channels his activism through the Black Quaker Project, which celebrates the lives and contributions of Quakers of color worldwide, documents and addresses their concerns. The talk you will hear today is drawn from the forthcoming book, Decolonization and the Cold War.
It's not forthcoming, it's coming.
Oh, fantastic. So this is it, if you haven't gotten it. Decolonization in the Cold War, African student elites in Moscow in the early 1960s, which is at once his unpublished doctoral dissertation at the University of Massachusetts and a memoir of his time in the Soviet Union. But before I hand over, give the floor to Hal, let me introduce Matt Meyer, who, in addition to being the editor of the book series out of which this book has come out, is also the General Secretary of the International Peace Research Association, and a former chair of the War Resistance League, and another two internationalists. For over 30 years, Matt has worked to build alternative education structures in New York City, nationally and internationally. Originally a high school teacher, he became a union leader in the United Federations of Teachers, and then a staff person at the Harvey Milk School. He has written numerous books, including Guns and Gandhi in Africa, Pan-African Insights on Nonviolence, Armed Struggle and Liberation in 2000, and Time is Tight, Urgent Tasks for Education and Transformation, Eritrea, South Africa, and the US. Matt is currently serving as the Senior Research Scholar at the University of Massachusetts.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll be very brief, because we want to get quickly to Dr. Weaver. But there are a couple of things worth saying. You know, when one reads a biography or has a biography of one read, it's always a little hard, because how do you live up to all these things that someone's written about you? But there's one important thing in my biography that was left out. My original alma mater, both really for academic work as an undergraduate and for work as an activist, came on these streets and at this university. I was an undergraduate at what was called WSUC, Washington Square University College here at New York University, and I cut my teeth in being an activist right here in these streets some thousands of years ago. But I'm here in a very different capacity, and one I feel very honored and privileged to be here for, because really this is not just a talk from Dr. Weaver. It's not just a launching of an exciting book. I have to pick it up because, you know, the way things work sometimes, we haven't but just felt it. This is my first time touching the book. It's really hot. It's almost actually literally hot, but it's not. It's figuratively hot off the presses. And I can't go further without recognizing another distinguished activist scholar in the room, Kasahun Chekol, who's the founder, CEO, and publisher of Africa World Press. So I know he loves us, and I know he loves us because of the tireless work he does, publishing, you know, dozens of books, thousands of books over the course of the decades. And yeah, it's all good. It's fine. Come on, it's all right. But he also loves us because he's here today because he loves us, but he's also here today because he had to get books for us, and we're just seeing it now, and it's great. But this is a launch not only of this book, and not only of a talk you're going to hear on a key part, neglected part of Soviet and Russian studies, and in some ways a neglected part of African studies, but it's really the first US launch, of the book series. Kasahun and Africa World Press were, as they always are, at the annual meeting of the African Studies Association last year. We kind of hinted that this series was coming out. We had some titles, we had some ideas, but now we have the first and second book in this series. My book, a primer, which basically launches the series and explains what the series is about, and Dr. Weaver's, which is the first book. I did my launch of this book at Oxford over the summer, and I have not done a launch in the US. So this day, this afternoon, marks the first launch of the African Peace series of Africa World Press. And you have here the first two books in that series. And in fact, this is a series that we put together under Kasahun and Africa World Press, Red Sea Press leadership, because we also thought beyond the Soviet piece that Dr. Weaver is an expert on, in general, this whole area of Africa, African and global South peace studies is a burgeoning but neglected and all too little known field. You know, it was here at NYU again in the early 1980s that we began to see in New York the beginning of this multidisciplinary thing that they called peace studies. And peace studies focused on disarmament. Some people called it conflict resolution or conflict studies. Some people called it war and peace studies. And throughout the US and throughout the world, we see it in different formations and different spaces. But even though the discipline of African peace studies per se, or the subdiscipline, has been around for 20, 30 years, it's rarely recognized, and it hasn't had seriously a series like this one that we launched this afternoon. So by having Africa World Press bring this series to life, and these are just the first two books, there'll be another book out before the end of this year, and several books a year henceforth. But the fact of the matter is, it's saying no. Africa is not the dark continent, the center of violence and war and conflict and genocide. Yes, There are civil wars in Africa, most of them fomented by or with their roots in policies of the West and the global North. But in fact, in addition to that fact, Africa is a center of an inspiring place for a place where we're seeing more and more growth, innovation, creativity, and grassroots activism on issues of peace with justice. So by launching the Africa Peace series, we're trying to bring that to the academic world and to the activist world in terms of Africa, but also in terms of the global South in general. Now, I'll say one or two more sentences about why this is the perfect book to be launching that series. I'm not saying it's a perfect book. We have no perfection here. We don't even strive for that. That's ridiculous. But it is the perfect book for launching this series because it brings into the series and into the world now all of the key elements that we're striving to bring in by having an African and Global South book series on peace. As you'll read, as you'll hear, and then hopefully as you'll buy and read, Dr. Weaver engages this subject not just as a deep scholar who has done the research and the work to credential him in all the ways you heard, but also to bring us through these times of African students, newly decolonized countries, using the Soviet Union as a space for thinking and rethinking and building what it means to be students and to be activists and to be scholars in the world. But he also is there as an on-the-ground participant. So as we try to do in peace studies, as we try to do in this book series, our authors are deeply engaged in the work they're involved in. They're not just activists who are doing anecdotal discussions of their work, and they're not just academics who are doing some from the top of the tower, looking down what to do. They're both. And Dr. Weaver is really a perfect example of that nexus between scholar and activist, between engaged involvement in the work. And you'll see, this is not a memoir, but there's a memoir in it. This is not, maybe the last word. Hopefully our books inspire others to do more. It's the 25th anniversary of my first book with Africa Press, Guns and Gandhi in Africa. And it from that emerged deeper scholarship on questions of nonviolence and armed struggle on the continent. So we need more studies about African engagement with the Soviet Union and Soviet solidarity with Africa. But this is a fundamental text that contributes to that body of work that we haven't had before. So rather than tease you any longer, let's hear from Dr. Weaver about race, decolonization, and the Cold War, and about what this book means and what we can learn from it. Dr. Howard Weaver.
What a pleasure to be here today. I won't tell you my story with NYU, but it's both happy and unhappy. Because the chair of the Department of Political Science did not accept my dissertation on Soviet African relations in the 1960s. He told me even before I submitted, that he said that they do not want you to write on this subject. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine the head of a department? Well, I'm not sure if the they was the CIA, because I'm almost confident that he was involved with the CIA. He published too many books each year not to have been involved. The CIA subsidized lots of books. And when the person does 4 or 5 a year or 3, I began to question. Anyway, I never found the answers who was the they, but I speculated. So I'm so happy, 50 or 60 years later, to be here. And NYU is the proper place to launch it. And Rosen, thank you very much for inviting us here. When I first met you in Moscow in 2014 at the African Studies Conference, I knew you were going to be a star. And you are doing great work to help change, to help civilize, to help modernize the field of Slavic studies in the United States. Take it away from the Cold War and put it into some other context, which is what we have tried to do in this book. I also want to thank, I wish I had time to thank other prominent scholars who had a role in my involvement in this field. W.B. Du Bois wrote a letter of introduction for me to the Soviet scholars in '61 before he went into exile. Elliot Skinner, my mentor, the first course I took in Africa was here at NYU before he became ambassador to Burkina Faso and then went on to have a leading career at Columbia. And Akira Iriye, the former chair of the history department at Harvard, who about 11 years ago said, you know, your dissertation should be a book. Your dissertation should be a book. It's a dissertation in international education, but it should be a book in transnational history. Try to do it for your 80th birthday. Well, 11 years later, at age 91, I'm happy that it's here. And thank Africa World Press. Thank Matt. Thank Emma. Emma. I need to think of your full name. Lima Lepsansky, Warner, Haverford historian, who's actually initiated action to do a biography of me, which he is currently working on. I want to thank the three of you. And I also want to thank, of course, my senior research assistants. You just got a promotion, Cooper, here publicly with Sue Spina. And so happy we've been working together these years. You've been a great asset as well as Sue. So there are hundreds of people I could thank, but that would take the whole presentation. And so we don't have time for that, but I want to make sure I mention, and of course, my life partner, Ann Steer Nash. And of course, we couldn't stop without thanking all the African students whom we had a chance to interview back in the early 60s. And even up until the interview in Geneva, our time spent with Jason Kessie, and his name will come up from time to time today because he was a leading, one of the persons that I counted on for lots of information, and we've become deep friends. And we last saw each other in Zanzibar. No, was it in Geneva. So I bring you greetings, colleagues and friends. Today, our preparation challenges Western scholarship, media, and beliefs about the participation of African students in Soviet transnational educational programs. Through personal testimony, we hope to shed light on the climate of Moscow at the height of the Cold War and to dispel past mistruths published by the Western press about the relations between Soviet people and African students seeking post-secondary education during this important time in African history, 1955 to 64. I first experienced Moscow in the summer of '59 as a member of the official USSR Youth Exchange Program. 2 years later, I returned to Moscow to attend the World Youth Forum. In 1962, I again sojourned in Moscow following the World Youth Festival in Helsinki, Finland. From July 1963 to February '64, I served as a journalist in the city for the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper, officially accredited by the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Drawing upon our experiences as a witness, as a participant, and even as an influencer, we seek to fill the gap between conventional wisdom and a shortage of evidence. My personal and research interests in African-Soviet relations intensified with each visit, with each, not just a visit, each sojourn, as I developed personal relationships with African students who were about my same age. Can you imagine how long ago that was? And with African scholars with Soviet scholars in African studies. So let us start now. Let us look at an example of being a witness. You can start the music now if you want. November 22nd, 1963. Moscow responds to JFK assassination. Were any of you around at that time? This looks like a young crowd, so I don't think there were many, there were few around. Well, do you remember where you were on that occasion, how you responded?
I was in high school.
Wow. And your school?
No, sorry. I was at City College as a freshman.
Wow. Right.
During November.
And how did City College respond?
And that gets a little murky. That's a number of years ago.
Okay,
I
okay.
can't remember yesterday.
Well, I can't remember yesterday either, but I remember this one very vividly because it was shocking.
Yeah.
Shocking how Moscow responded. The assassination was shocking, but how Moscow responded. Got that? On November,
Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
Wow. That was something. So on 22nd November 1963, I was in the Moscow apartment of Lily Golden, an Afro-Soviet researcher. She actually published her autobiography is published by Africa World Press too. I must say it's flawed with creativity. Great creativity. She was born to a Jewish Polish mother and an African-American father. As an interracial couple active within the American Communist Party, Lily's parents had sought refuge in the Soviet Union. As discrimination against interracial couples intensified. You know, at that time, there were not many states that allowed interracial sex or interracial marriage, interracial relationships across gender. As I was interviewing Lily, and the announcement of President Kennedy's death came over Moscow radio, Lily's mother, Bertha Golden, gasped, and I can even remember her intonation some 62 years later. Oh my God, they have killed that young man.
Mm.
Oh my God, they have killed that young man. Her emotional response was not the only one. I saw citizens of Moscow crying in the streets.
Mm.
And some of my local colleagues telephoned me to express their sympathies. Soviet political leader Nikita Khrushchev rushed back to Moscow from his dacha on the Black Sea to meet with American Ambassador Foy Kohler, seeking assurances that there would be no change in USA policy. No change. This was reported directly to us, accredited American journalists, by Ambassador Kohler during our weekly Friday meeting. We had a weekly Friday meeting with the ambassador. And as it turned out, for some reason, he invited me to dinner once, and I learned from his charge de corps that I was the only journalist that he had ever invited to have a meal with him. Moscow radio would play. What was the music you were listening to? Does anyone recognize that? Anyone? Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony, known as Pathetique.
Mm.
That is what Moscow radio played honoring Kennedy. They cut out all other broadcasts and they played that. Can you imagine in this country playing when Fidel, a so-called antagonist, died, playing empathetic music like that? Only because I was in Moscow did I hear that. I would have never have believed it otherwise. So the second item I want to start to share with you is a participant. That was a witness. This was as a participant, December 18th, 1963. Africans in Moscow respond to the death of a Ghanaian medical student and how the USA press erroneously reported the incident. Just a few weeks later, a Ghanaian medical student was found frozen to death, suspected by some as murder, as he was about to marry a local Russian woman. We were called to the Ghanaian embassy to hear a report on his death from Ambassador Elliott, with whom I earlier spent one night finishing a bottle of scotch together at his residence. The gathering at the embassy evolved into a march. Whether the march was planned or spontaneous, I to this day do not know. But I did participate with several hundred African students in marching from the Ghanaian embassy to Red Square. Others marched to the Kremlin to meet with the Soviet Minister of Higher and Specialized Secondary Education, Yelutin, and ask for the official Soviet viewpoint on the matter. How did the American press report on this event? 500 African Africans fight police in Moscow in race protests, from the New York Times. I guess you have that up now, Cooper, huh? African students riot, battle police, from the AP report by way of the Carroll Daily Times Herald, I guess in Iowa. And African students storm the Kremlin in racial riot in a Wednesday evening Green Bay paper. Well, friends and colleagues, there was no riot. There was a peaceful march that you saw a picture of, but there was no riot. These moments in history remain very close to me and vivid for me, even 62 years later. The shock of having a so-called adversary play funeral music for our slain president, the tears of Muscovites in the streets, and the nasty headlines spread by the American press in response to a symbolic protest. Had I not been in Moscow, I would not have known these realities exist, as we don't tend to get the information in the United States. In fact, whenever I see something positive in the press about China or about Russia, certainly about the old Soviet Union, I'm surprised. I really am, because it's very consistently negative and untrue. So my actions in Moscow, now we go to third, influencer. Tanzanian Jason Kessie revelation in Geneva 2021. My actions in Moscow had ripple effects, I was to learn later. I could not anticipate and would remain unaware of for over 6 decades. Jason Kessie, my key student informant at Friendship University in the 1960s, and now a dear friend, hosted a dinner party for my partner Anne and me in Geneva in October 2021. He revealed something to us that had happened these 60 so or years ago in Moscow, which I had never heard before. In addition to his appreciation for my introducing him to his wife, Ruth, a visiting British Quaker teacher at the local British USA school in Moscow, he expressed his deep gratitude that I had advised him not to be a part of a photo being taken by my Look journalist friend, Ernie Dunbar. Look magazine, how many of you remember Look magazine? Probably not very many. It was a very popular US magazine with lots of photographs by my Look journalist friend Ernie Dunbar for an article he was writing for his popular American magazine. Jason shared that all the African students pictured in the published magazine article were expelled from the USSR. He expressed his deep gratitude that my advice saved him from that fate. After earning his credentials by graduating from the Friendship University, Jason went on to get a master's from the London School of Economics and have a successful career at the United Nations in Geneva, and later as a businessman in his home country, Tanzania, an evolution from the Marxist he was as a student in Moscow in the 1960s. Let us discuss the experience of African students in Moscow during a pivotal decade of decolonization with a case study from Patrice Lumumba University for the peoples of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Patrice Lumumba University for the peoples of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The years between 1955 and 1964 represent a critical period in the emergence of African nationalism. and unprecedented uprising against European colonial powers. It marked the beginning of a new age in Africa, a time to cast aside the vestiges of colonial domination with its political, economic, and cultural strangleholds. Importantly, as the period that represented a shift from dependence to self-determination, it was crucial for Africans to develop the requisite expertise and skills and have the self-confidence to play new and expedient roles. The USSR, as the leader of the socialist power bloc, represented an alternative model to Western ideas and practices on racial advancement, especially in the field of education. The radical political and economic ideas and the disparate educational models they presented to African scholars and leaders were cautiously embraced by some African politicians, eagerly adopted by others, and of course, rejected by some. In order to help newly independent sub-Saharan African countries overcome deficiencies in human resources, Soviet authorities established an experimental post-secondary training center. Soviet political and educational authorities expected this institution, the Patrice Lumumba University, to become instrumental in the struggle for decolonization and true independence in the global South. In February 1960, during his first visit to the Third World, Indonesia, remember, which had earlier hosted the 1955 Bandung Conference of independent African and Asian countries. The Soviet head of government and party indicated why the new university was needed. And I quote him: to give aid to colonial and neo-colonial third world countries in the training of their national cadre of engineers, agricultural specialists, doctors, teachers, economists, and specialists in other branches of knowledge. The Soviet government has decided to set up in Moscow a university to educate in a spirit of humanism and friendship of the nation. A significant factor about this university was the attention given to recruiting talented young people coming from poor families. They specifically aimed this at university at this. In his speech, Khrushchev announced some of the problems many Africans themselves considered as limiting Africa's progress and development. Prominent was that little attention was paid to technology and the applied sciences in higher education in Africa. We will now examine how the university responded in this crucial decade of decolonization to the absence of technology and applied sciences available to students in Africa through its innovative program and curriculum development, through its innovative recruitment, selection, and sponsorship, and through its special treatment of Africans once they arrived in Moscow. Once they arrived in Moscow. So, the Lumumba University curricula, which I think Cooper is putting up now, to implement Soviet objectives, the university was organized into one general preparatory faculty and 6 subject areas, disciplines and specializations. 1, engineering, including geology, and we'll say more about geology later because it's very important in terms of confronting neocolonialism. Number two, physics, mathematics, chemistry, and biology. Number three, economics and international law. Number four, philology and history. Number five, medicine, and number six, agriculture. Students selected a major in collaboration with the faculty in their freshman year. Around 1,200 or 70% of the total student body of 1725 in 1962-63 were majoring in the natural, physical, or medical sciences. The percentage of Africans in medicine, engineering, physics, chemistry, biology, and agriculture was at least 75%, and perhaps higher. Now let's do this, let's do a little case study of geology because it's extremely important when we realize that even today, the Western countries are taking advantage of mineral resources in Namibia, the Congo, all throughout Africa, stripping them, raping them, even though they have been so-called independent since the 1960s. The Lumumba University curriculum reflected the priority of Soviet political and academic leaders for African control of natural resources. And let me say this, at the same time that this university was being created to help Africans, the United States government, from Eisenhower and Kennedy on down to everyone, was plotting the assassination of Lumumba in the Congo and the overthrow of Nkrumah in Ghana, which they successfully carried out. At the same time that the Soviets were providing this education, our government was destabilizing by murder and other means African leadership. The Lumumba University curriculum reflected the priority of Soviet political and academic leaders for African control of natural resources. The geology department in the Faculty of Engineering prominently epitomized this priority. Training was not limited to the classroom. Practical experience was gained through work in mines, oil fields, laboratories, as well as on geological expeditions. The training they received culminated in the production of a research paper, kind of a thesis, which students documented finding from their respective home countries. We will now examine the relationship between the curriculum in geology on the one hand and African realities on the other, as pinpointed by the Soviet political leadership and senior Soviet scholars in African studies. Key Soviet political leaders expressed the need to diffuse technological skills in mineral extraction. In his insightful speech to the 15th session of the United Nations General Assembly on 18 September 1959. Let me pause. Many of you remember how the Western press reported Khrushchev's visits to the UN, don't you? Banging his shoe on the table. That's what we heard. But we didn't hear about what he was actually saying. And let me quote him. The people of many of these countries have won political independence, but they are still cruelly exploited by foreigners economically. Their oil and other natural resources are being plundered. They are being taken out of their countries for almost nothing in return, even while they yield huge profits to the foreign exploiters. Soviet scholars also reiterated in their published works the same charges made by their political leaders. The widely respected academician, Professor I.I. Petyakin, the founding director of Moscow's Africa Institute, to whom I had the privilege of carrying a letter of introduction from W.B. Du Bois before his voluntary exile in Ghana in July 1961, accused Western prospectors of intentionally underestimating the mineral potential of African countries. The result of such distortion were twofold. One was it misled African political and economic decision makers into underestimating their own resources available for economic development. The other was that the nations received smaller remuneration for their raw materials than those to which they were entitled. What effect did Petyakin feel that the development of mining and other industries had on African leadership coping with post-independence problems? He concluded, and I quote him, "The main condition for the obtaining of economic independence and for the creation of a harmoniously developed economy is the development of industry." The slogan of industrialization is one of the most popular slogans in contemporary Africa. But the economically weak states of Africa do not at present have the strength for a creation of large-scale enterprises of the various metallurgical or machine-building industries. Therefore, industrialization is beginning with the enlargement of a mining industry. The building of hydroelectric stations and enterprises of light industry plants for the processing of agricultural products. This shows to me that the Soviet political leaders and scholars in African studies understood what African countries needed to become truly independent and not merely constitutionally independent. Let us turn next to recruitment, selection, and sponsorship. The Soviets used a variety of personnel and organizations to publicize and to recruit for the university. For example, at the World Youth Festival of Youth and Students in Helsinki in 1962, I observed the recruitment campaign as aggressive, relying heavily on third world students from Lumumba University themselves, who often worked together in congenial teams. Among these students, again, was my friend Jason Kesey. Minimal bureaucracy, a focus on subjects obviously geared to meet African human resource needs, and an emphasis on opportunities for training in the fields which Africans were not receiving at home or in the West. At home or in the West were among the characteristics of recruiting efforts. The prorector, Professor Eurasian, traveled throughout Africa and Asia to recruit high-quality students. Soviet consulates and embassies in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Europe were also used for the dissemination of information and the reception of application. Once accepted, the students were guests of the Soviet government, which took care of all expenses, virtually all expenses. Tuition and medical care were free for all citizens and non-citizens. Students from Africa were at Friendship University under varying sponsorship. Some, like many from South Africa, were under the dictatorial apartheid regime. were in Moscow on scholarships offered directly by the USSR. Another group was under United Nations programs, both in trust territories and in non-self-governing territories, in which the Soviet Union participated. Under a third sponsorship were those students with scholarships subsidized by home governments or dominant political parties. The fourth sponsorship were non-governmental international organizations with close ties to the USSR, such as the International Union of Students in Prague. I want to move along now to give you an example of a really unusual example. But before that, I want to mention that many students from East, Central, South, and Central Africa knew that if they found their way to Cairo, then they would be provided university training in the Soviet Union or its partners in Poland and Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, etc. But I want to emphasize now the special example. Take the special example of a young Kenyan student so highly motivated to become a doctor that he actually walked from Nairobi to Cairo over a 2-year period, assured that if he were to reach Cairo, he would be able to study free of charge in a socialist country. In his case, he was assigned to a medical school in Poland. His story continued to be a happy one. He married a Polish classmate, raised a family of 2 successful filmmakers and television creators, and later returned to Kenya with her, where they both became immersed in the Kenyan health service. This is an unbelievable example of the Soviet mandate to give priority to poor students. His son Jacob invited me to Zanzibar in 2005 to chair the international jury of the Zanzibar International Film Festival, allowing me the opportunity then to interview his father and mother. What about the affective experience of African students in Moscow? When Paul Robeson arrived in Moscow in the fall of 1935, at the invitation of the great Soviet filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein to discuss making a film on the leaders of the Haitian Revolution, he was warmly embraced by the Soviet political and artistic elite and the general public, exclaiming, quote, "For the first time in my life, I walk in full human dignity. For the first time in my life, I walk in full human dignity." Just as Robeson and his fellow sojourning African-American writer Langston Hughes discovered, African students in Moscow received a warm welcome. They were given preferential treatment by a system that insisted that they succeed, a system that insisted that they succeed in their studies, and tended to find a warm, hospitable reception from faculty, fellow students, and the general population. At the university, the first-year preparatory faculty instructors often came to the African students' dorm rooms to give them one-on-one tutorials to help with the Russian language, to ensure their success. But it was the warm, passionate sexual relations that I witnessed between African males and Soviet females that was especially empowering for many African males, while at the same time antagonistic to some of their Soviet male counterparts. And then there were drunken Moscow men and women who were heard to curse Chairman Khrushchev for bringing in favored foreigners, who they said were taking valuable resources away from Soviet students and other citizens. These were the exceptions and not the rule, as mainstream Western media and scholarship would have us believe. African students also received language lessons from Russian students, with whom they often shared dormitory rooms. African students that I interviewed acknowledged and appreciated that their teachers wanted them to succeed in their studies and were willing to give them individual attention to help this happen. I want to wind down by just mentioning my research methods and approaches. How does our revisionist oppositional research on the Soviet education of an emerging African intellectual class differ from the dominant approach of North Americans and European scholars over the past half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century? As Palestine scholar activist Edward Said of Columbia University pointed out, oppositional research aims to challenge the dominant narrative, both in methodology and in conclusion. Antithetical knowledge is produced by people who quite consciously consider themselves to be writing in opposition to perceived orthodoxy. Our study aims for such an oppositional narrative, to use primary sources, the African students themselves, in order, one, to explore a possible new reality, and two, to confront decades of misinformation and disinformation that have become entrenched scholarship and media narratives. We approach old questions with new eyes. So, in conclusion, I want to note the following. In conclusion, the Soviet programs in this crucial decade of African decolonization, 1955 to 64, demonstrate creative and pragmatic innovation with one, program development and dedicated to meeting African needs. Program development dedicated to meeting African needs and priorities, with a curriculum focusing on technology, health, natural and physical sciences, including geography. Two, non-traditional admissions procedures in recruitment, selection, and sponsorship. Three, an emancipatory environment that empowered future African elites with the knowledge and skills and the feeling of empowerment through self-confidence needed in an independent post-colonial Africa. Thank you, friends. We welcome your questions, your comments, and in our dialogue. Thank you, brother.
Thank you, Harold. This was fantastic. So let me take questions first from the in-person audience. And whoever is listening to us online and has questions, there are probably 90 of you. Could you raise your virtual hand so that I can call on you? Or maybe if you prefer to, you can also type your question in the chat and I can read it, but ideally you can ask it with your own voice. But yes, so I'm sure we have lots of questions. Mina. Sorry, maybe you can introduce people can introduce yourself.
I'm Mia Magda. I just started here at NYU in social and cultural analysis, which is co-sponsoring this event.
I've heard about you and I'm happy you're here. Heard about you from our dear mutual friend.
I'm happy you're here as well.
Thank you.
So hopefully this is not too in the weeds, but
Okay.
one thing I was thinking about when you spoke about recruitment efforts is how sort of particularized they were towards certain countries. If there were greater concentrations of students at the Friendship University from specific African countries. And one of the reasons I'm wondering about this is because I wonder how the non-aligned movement may have sort of impacted the migrations of African students to the Soviet Union.
Well, of course, in general, the non-aligned movement to which you refer was in the process of developing, as you know, with the 64 conference in Cairo that I happen to have attended. Our research takes place before that. So you had certain radical African countries that had diplomatic relations. Ghana, Guinea, Mali. But you also had Ethiopia under Haile Selassie was not a radical country, but Haile Selassie was the first African head of state to visit the Soviet Union. And I happened to be at the airport at the same time in 59, summer 59. But that was because of the tradition of the Russian Orthodox Church and the Ethiopian Church collaborating. So those countries obviously had an open flow. Then, of course, you had countries like South Africa under apartheid regime, which, of course, kept its students from going where they would want to go, and they were part of that group that they would go illegally and not to report back to their parents even until they got where they were going. Then you had countries like Nigeria, which was not sympathetic or empathetic to the Soviet government, but you had a trade union movement there, which helped on the left, which I happened to have given a lecture to once when I was there in the 60s. They would go through that trade union to get there, to get to that. So that is how I would respond to your question. Of course, once the AAU began to get its act together, then the Soviets also were able to have a more systematic system of recruitment that they could do in conjunction with the Organization of African Union. Thank you for your question.
I was specifically interested in Nigeria, so thanks for that.
Pardon me?
I was specifically interested
Oh,
in
Nigeria.
so thanks
Yeah.
for that.
Thank you.
We have a virtual hand from Nick Danforth.
Oh, Nick.
So, sorry, I think
His audio is off.
you may have to mute yourself.
To unmute himself now.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
We can see you too, Nick.
I just wanted to reinforce or second the motion of Hal that the shock, even after 60 years, the shock of this rethinking scholarship and rethinking our orientations of the past is absolutely fascinating. I've known Hal since I met him in the training preparations for Crossroads Africa in 1960. And we went to West Africa. This was a precursor of the Peace Corps, Crossroads Africa. And we were pretty carefully briefed to realize or to argue that when the local West Africans we were working with were critical of the United States, we would always say that we are doing our best to to stop racism and stop Jim Crow. And the Russians were not doing nearly as well as we were, because the Russians didn't have a history of slavery like we had to confront in the United States. And later, when I went to the Helsinki Youth Festival, I don't think I met you there, Hal, but I was there with a group from Yale, and we had this same briefing. We were told to always argue that the Soviets didn't have to face the legacy, the history of slavery that we had to face in the United States. And we should always, if we met African students, for example, at Helsinki, this was the World Youth Festival in Helsinki, we were briefed on how to explain to them that the Russians were welcoming them because they didn't have this overarching history of slavery and racism in the United States. And the assignment we had was to try to speak positively of all the efforts we were making in the US, but we all knew that very little was being done to help Africa. And so it was an awkward situation for many of us, both in the Crossroads Africa summers and in the Helsinki Youth Festival. And we were always told that the Russians were sending not youth, but goons to the conferences. They were not students, they were in their 40s and 50s, so they obviously were not students. And they were all being paid by the by the government in Moscow to attend these student youth festivals as if they were students. The irony was that many of us had gotten grants from the CIA to attend the conference ourselves. So even though we were supposedly suspecting the Russian participants in the conference of being Soviet apparatchiks, we ourselves turned out, we found out later, we had sponsorship from the CIA to attend that conference. So ironically, we were getting only one half of the picture, and that's the point that Hal is making so vividly today, that we were not aware of what was really going on behind the scenes. And I'm still learning. Here we are 60 plus years later, 70 years later. It's an eye-opener, Hal, and I'm very grateful to you. Thank you so much for talking about it and writing about it. Thanks.
Thank you, Nick. I should also mention, in terms of the World Youth Festival, who was one of the major recruiters for the group that I was in and the group that Nick apparently was in, was Gloria Steinem.
Yes.
Never in her biography or autobiography is that ever mentioned. Never have I seen it mentioned that she was the leading recruiter to the youth festival to make sure that there was a non-communist faction present.
Right.
Thank you. That was fascinating. My name's Anne Lounsbury. I teach here in the Russian and Slavic Studies.
Oh, great. What is your, and what?
Lounsbury.
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 Thank you.
And I have a question about the networks that I assume formed among the students who met in the Soviet Union and then went back to Africa, presumably, and pursued careers. Did they stay in touch with each other? Are these kind of networks traceable once they leave the Soviet Union? I'm just curious about the long-term effects of the connection. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I want to mention the example of a person from Uganda who was actually at Moscow State University and not Lumumba University. He was the head of the African Students Organization, Federation of African Students. And he later went to Cairo to study Islam. He was Muslim. He later became foreign minister and ambassador in several countries. we hooked up in, was he and Kessie? He and Kessie stayed in touch. So we, all three of us got together in Dar, I think it was. But I'm not aware of an organized network. When I was in Zanzibar as the head of the festival jury, and later the jury that selected the best film on slavery, and we helped UNESCO organize a conference on film and slavery in Africa. I met a Russian doctor whose son had inadvertently killed a Zanzibar person and therefore was imprisoned. And she stayed on there as a successful parent to keep him company. She was trying to help the Russians, the post-Soviet Russians, organize some way of keeping in touch with the students. But I'm not aware of any student-led effort to stay together.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I might say that Cassie, who felt very comfortable when he was a student in Moscow, was reluctant to return in post-Soviet Russia because of the fact that many people of African ancestry, if they were found caught out at night alone, they suffered. And he stayed in the best hotel he could stay in Moscow. And we were to meet, to take the train to Trans-Siberia, but unfortunately to China, but unfortunately a Russian visa was not forthcoming to me. And when my Haverford classmate, who was a member of the club with the Russian ambassador, tried to intervene, the Russian ambassador said, because the United States makes it so difficult for our students, our people, to get American visas, although I would like to, I'm not going to intervene in this particular case. It's a tit for tat. That's the way diplomacy, international diplomacy is, isn't it? Tit for tat.
But just maybe to add, I think more recently in the 2010s, Patrice Lumumba did develop an alumni office, you know, seeking to mobilize those networks for different purposes. But so this is already, you know, a later point, you know.
Thank you.
Soviet. But we have questions from Luis Miller and then Gavin Wright. And if Luis could unmute himself.
You should see a pop-up window on your screen. There we go.
Is it unmuted now?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. So I've known Hal a long time. We were students together at Haverford. But what I wanted to talk about is there are a lot of things that have not been highlighted that I want to highlight. One of them, Harold Varmus, who was head of NIH at the time, was a Nobel laureate, decided as head of NIH to try to establish and build science in Africa. And he created this malaria group, and the group still persists. This is 1997, I guess, was their first meeting in Dakar. And this meeting still goes on. Every 4 years they get together, and different African countries run this meeting. And it's the most severe disease, one of the very bad diseases that affects children. And this was really a major thing. And I'm glad to have helped him, but mostly glad that Harold Varmus did this, and it still goes on. His goal was to build science in Africa, and he did do that to a great deal. And and the fact that it continues today is quite a wonderful thing.
Thank you, Lou. Lou was my classmate at my roommate at Harvard, my senior year. He also headed up several NIH institutes. And he himself has gotten international awards for his work in malaria. And it was Lou and others who nominated a Chinese scientist for the Nobel Prize because of she had saved millions of African lives through her invention during it was in any case, and end the point. Thank you, Lou, for your intervention.
Okay, thank you, Hal.
So we have an in-person question and then to Gavin.
Professor, my friend Abida. In my former life, I was a play producer, and I had the opportunity to produce Aimé Césaire's Season in the Congo.
Oh, wow.
And so I want to talk to you ask you about Patrice Lumumba and his speech to the King of Belgium when he was very insulting about the exploitation of minerals going to Belgium. And I mean, the whole thing went to the left. And the only country that he could call upon for help that was responsive was the Soviet Union. Of course, it didn't materialize anything fruitful for him, and that he passed on. But the backlash, and I'll call it backlash by virtue of the fact that they named the Friendship University Patrice Lumumba University. I wonder how did that play out in the world political stage? Is that a fair question to ask?
Of course it is. Of course it is. I'm glad you mentioned the moment and that speech. That speech happens to be in our book.
Oh, good.
Because I feel it's an important representation of how Africans were mistreated, not only by their Belgium colonizers, but also by the Dutch in South Africa and by the French and by the English. But they were consistently mistreated in the Congo. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a book called White Malice. White Malice. If you really want to understand the role of the United States, Lou mentioned health. Well, that was 1994. That was 30 years later. That's great. But what was the US doing in the 60s? But destabilizing African governments and being responsible for the murder of Patrice Lumumba. And so obviously the Soviets responded in a positive way because he was a true patriot. It's a crime what the US did. Eisenhower and Kennedy were involved, especially Eisenhower.
And Dulles.
Well, all the way down, yes. But the point is, it was from the top to the bottom. Even the presidents were involved in these folks who tried to kill Fidel later. That wasn't this wasn't the first time. This was a part of US policy to assassinate, to kill. Political violence has been a part of US history, important part of US history.
Let's not forget Dag Hammarskjöld.
That's right, and the count, yeah.
Thank you.
I'm glad you mentioned that particular point of, it's a beautiful play too. I'm happy you directed it. Produced it, sorry, good, thank you.
Great, so Gavin, if you could unmute yourself.
Who's talking now?
Yep.
Yeah.
Hello, Hal. I want to say hello. You may recall meeting me at the Casa de los Amigos a few years back.
Yes, I do.
And I want to congratulate you on getting this book out. Number one, I wrote a book on civil rights in which I said I must be close to the world record because it took me 50 years. But I think you may have beat me here.
I wouldn't be surprised. I'm happy for both of us.
Well, okay, mine
I'm
was
sure Stanford University is happy for you too.
Well, I'm retired, so Stanford University doesn't really care anymore, but still, I was pleased to finally get it out. You know, recalling, you mentioned the question, do people remember where they were on November 22nd, 1963? It happened, I was a student at Swarthmore College. You're
I
a
won't
friendly
hold that
rival.
against you as a Haverfordian.
I went through some files recently and found a talk that I gave at the meeting in Philadelphia of the American Friends Service Committee, and the talk was about my experience that summer on a voting registration project sponsored by the AFSC. And I looked at the paper. On the front was the date, November 22nd, 1963. I can't quite believe that that event actually happened that day. Maybe it was somewhat after. But anyway, that's enough about me. Let me convert this into a question. Since you gave us such a vivid depiction of the reaction in Moscow to that assassination, can you say what was the thinking or the awareness of the American civil rights movement at that time? Did they understand that by that time Kennedy had gone through his own conversion, and at that point he was a progressive? His message of June of 1963 was a major breakthrough. It became the basis for the Civil Rights Act. But he had a checkered history on both the race issue and the Cold War issues prior to that. Maybe this is not quite a fair question, but can you augment your description a bit more to talk about the civil rights issues?
I actually don't think I can, because I missed the March on Washington on August 28th, 63, because I was in Moscow. And I was pretty much focusing on things in the Soviet Union, African students at that time. So I don't think I can add anything to what you have written and said about this particular subject. Did you
Okay,
want to
thanks
add
anyway.
anything to share any light from your own research as an outstanding economist?
Well, thank you for those kind words, but certainly in my research, I was not thinking too much about the view from Moscow. So, hey, let's get together and catch up on both ends of that exchange when next we have a chance.
Sounds good, and give my best wishes to your son, Nico. I miss seeing him in Mexico these days.
Will do. He's fine. He's director of the Quaker Center here in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And so I'll convey that greetings to him.
I'd be pleased to. Thank you.
Great. Any questions from our physical audience, or should we? Yes, then could you introduce yourself?
My name is Pablo Smith. You've been working on religious nationalism and studying as a visiting fellow at Jordan Center. I have a question on whether there were any encounters or interesting dialogues between African students in Soviet Union, Lumumba University, but also in other countries of Soviet bloc. Yes, you mentioned Poland, Bulgaria, and anti-Soviet, Soviet students, people in Poland, Hungary, who didn't feel comfortable with the regime. So did any, in a way, anti-colonial conversation happen ever at that level?
I'm not aware of that. I was not privy to that in Moscow or elsewhere. I don't even know how you can get that information.
I can add something to that.
Yes. Please.
As someone who worked and taught in Mexico for many years, I met a wonderful couple, Professor Americo from UNAM, and my colleague from Decolonization de Mexico, who met at Lumumba University, a Japanese and a Mexican. They're married, have wonderful 3 children, and have lived happily in Mexico, still do. Their experience from telling me is that they were relating very strongly with other African students. And the solidarity and sense of commonality was very, very strong. So I would not be surprised that some guys from Latin America, what have you, also interacted other ways.
Thank you very much, appreciate it.
There's a hand up by Addis Mason, so Addis, if you could unmute yourself.
There should be a pop-up window on your screen. You can click on. There we go.
Sorry, I'm not sure. I think that was an accident. I'm sorry.
In that case, may I ask my own question, which is partly related to yours, which I have to say maybe we should be looking for such examples later on in the 70s and 80s after such more anti-Soviet attitudes probably become more common among students from Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union themselves, but maybe from the 60s, late 50s, 60s, it would be a little early. But my question specifically is about your interactions with the African students. How were you perceived as an African American? I assume you deliberately sought them out around Moscow State University or Lumumba, yes, yes, if you could tell us how they saw you.
With pleasure. I was 29 then, 91 now. I was about the same age as most of those students. We hung out together. We partied together. We got into trouble together. So I was just another African. Just happened to have been born in North America, which is how I identify as an African born in North America. So I had wonderful relations with the African students. Wonderful relations. And some of those continue today. We mentioned a couple of examples.
Yes, Matt.
All right, I didn't want to jump on first, but we've had a number of good questions. I'm gonna ask an unfair one.
I'll try to answer it.
Yeah, well, it's unfair because we both spoke to each other about what we wouldn't say today, and this didn't make the cut. But since we're coming towards the end. All right, so it's 2025. We don't have a Soviet Union anymore. But Russia still seems to be in the news somewhere or other. The era of decolonization is in some ways past. We're seeing recolonization and intensification of neocolonialism. And yet it seems in some ways, or at least it seems to us, that some of these conversations and some of the lessons learned are as relevant today and significant for the future as they were when we were 29. So I will open the door to a conversation, no definitive answer, but your take to start us off about how and why these conversations, this book, this work is relevant for our work today and tomorrow.
I'm going to turn that back to
No.
you.
No.
Why
it's unfair.
I wanted
No, I'm sorry.
You asked me to deal
Sorry,
with that.
you're the person. No. You go first. I'll say something after you.
You're the person that I wanted to answer that question.
Okay, we will both, but you start.
I'm not going to self-promote, so you're going to have to do it.
No, you have to start. You start us off. I'll say something. I promise you I will, but you start.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me that the Cold War myths, truths, and antagonisms towards the Soviet Union are as deep today against Russia and Putin as they were during those times. Whether they're justified or not, I cannot say, but I think the level of ignorance, the level of antagonism, the level of negativity has not significantly towards Russia has not changed significantly since the Cold War negativity. Press and scholarship. That's how I would start us off. You next.
Okay. No, I mean, of course I agree, and yet hindsight always makes everything sharper, right? So it's easy now, you know, it's not just that we get wiser when we get more gray, it's just we sound wise, because we figure out how to do that. Sometimes maybe we get wiser too, I don't know. But the fact is that looking back, it seems like things could be clearer then, at least at this idea of hope at what the Soviet Union could offer. And there's not so much hope now about what anyone can offer. I don't agree with some of the questions about JFK was a changed man and was about to do all these great things for the so-called Negro in so-called America. But the fact of the matter is, even there was a sense of hope, and then the assassination, a shattering of that hope. So, you know, I know in the moment, and I was very young, even younger than, you know, some of you youngsters, but not the ones who weren't born yet. But, you know, I know the assassination shattered something, but I also know that the continuum of US empire was essentially unshaken. And the lack of a Soviet Union in the world, whatever corrupting force it become by the late 80s, also changed a lot about global geopolitics. So we're faced with a world now which is not two superpowers, but 3 or 4 or 5, or 1, and a time where colonialism has not ended, as I said in the question. Part of the work I do is with direct colonies still in existence, which includes Palestine and Puerto Rico, and includes Western Sahara in Africa and West Papua. It includes Kurdistan, Rojava, Kashmir, Tibet, etc., etc. But that's the tip of the recolonization iceberg in terms of neocolonialism. And then you have, you know, the alliance in West Africa is saying, oh, we're going to do something else, something interesting, maybe a new Pan-Africanism. What does Pan-Africanism mean for the 21st century? And I think in that context, yes, it was at a time the Soviet Union and communism was the evil, capital T, capital E. And now we have a few evils. For some it's Putin. For some it's China. For some it's Hamas. For some it's the US, only the US. And anything against the US is good. Whereas many of our friends in South Africa and Brazil and other places say BRICS is not an anti-imperialist force. It's just an anti-US imperialist force. So I think we do, it seems to me, live in somewhat more complex times. But again, 30 years from now, it may not look as complex as it does to us in the moment. But I think your book, frankly, and I think these people-to-people interactions that actually provide foundations for new thinking. You and the other African students in Moscow at that moment, those people-to-people connections, people-to-people diplomacy, the building of grassroots bottom-up people's movements, those are as significant, if not more, than they were in the day, because we have fewer states that excite us about how to move forward. And I think this book contributes to literature about the history of and contemporary need for people-to-people diplomacy and movements that are not just built state to state, but that can use states for some good things when we can, and use relationships, transcontinental and international relationships, when they don't. So now it's the rest of you that have to answer the question. Sorry,
I'd like to actually add something to this. I think that Dr. Reaver's book, this conversation, and others like it are incredibly important now in terms of clarifying what's happening with Russia and the new scramble for Africa, right? Because this legacy has been resurrected, right, as like a continuation. What's happening now is a continuation of this specific period. And there are a lot of holes to poke in that representation of these incursions into the Sahel region and beyond. So I think in knowing this history, right, and keeping it close, we can make determinations about whether Russia, the Russian Federation today, is actually on the continent in order to sort of co-author African self-determination in the 21st century, which I have my doubts about for sure.
But it's a great answer, and a great question.
I met someone recently, no, not recently, but several years ago, who was a student from Ghana and studied at University. And what I always, even though I don't particularly like the guy, but what I would always respect about him is that he carried with him a sense of pride. One, for the experience, that cross-cultural experience, and the education. I mean, this was something he said, you can't take this away from me. I learned a lot at Moscow University. You know what I mean? So I don't know what you mean, because a flashback and they tell you that. So thank you.
Yes, please. I just want to make 2 points from Matt's point. Those of us who come from Africa are active in the African decolonization movement, still feel that Africa is a colony in the West. The most critical thing, the most difficult thing to answer is that our minds have been colonized and continue to be colonized by Western ideology, by Western thinking. Forget our minerals, forget our sea wealth, forget all the other things, but our minds are still corrupted. Western culture. So decolonization movement is an ongoing thing for us, an ongoing thing in South Africa. In Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who pushed the idea that we're not free people yet. That yet has to come. Very important. Remember, Dr. Weber, as the Soviet Union was also developing African students in the Soviet Union, the United States was doing something similar in the 1960s with the role of the Kennedys in particular, with the African American Institute, in which they brought Africans from Africa. One came from huge group from Kenya, funded by the good friends in Langley and what have you. And that, in fact, that institute still exists. It's still trying to garner African fellowship towards the American thinking. But the tragic thing about it is that once the Soviet Union broke down to what we call Russia now, Soviet's positive role ended. And that's a tragedy. Now we have Soviet soldiers fighting in Africa for money, not for ideology, not for sympathy or empathy. They're fighting for how to fill their pockets. And by and large, subsidized by the state. So what was positive has turned negative in our times. The United States, however, continues to try to influence African intellectual might, which is incredible at this level, at all levels, and how to influence it towards a Western capitalist thinking that has not served us well. Well, I'm afraid that we'll be ending on this grim note, but also with the promise and hope of mining actually those hopes and utopias that did exist in this first Cold War, which and also all these examples of international solidarity and cultural ambassadorship, of which Cal is really, an exhibit A. So I do think looking back actually does serve some purpose.
Yes.
So on this note, thank you so much for coming in person or virtually. Thank you, Hal, for writing this book and sharing it with us here. Thank you.